Hello everyone. So I realize I am doing another video fairly quickly after my last one, which is not something I usually do. But I had a really good comment / question on one of my videos the other day, and I realized as I was thinking about it this morning that it really is something I should probably do an entire video about, just to clarify it for everyone. And the question related to folklore versus fiction. So the comment itself had mentioned that I do tend to talk a lot about folklore and sort of compare it or contrast it or, versus the idea of fiction. And the commentator was sort of wondering, what is the difference between folklore and fiction? And could I give some examples of folklore? So kind of contemplating that, I realized that this is something that we probably really do need to clarify. It's not obviously strictly on the topic just of fairies, but I think if fairies are a subject that interests you, or my entire series of YouTube videos have interested you, then this is probably something that we all need to be on the same page with. So today's video, folklore versus fiction. I do want to start this video by saying, establishing a couple things. So personally, I kind of have a foot in both worlds, as it were. I do believe in the actual reality and existence of these beings that we call fairies, but I also am very invested in studying them and studying them through the lens of the existing beliefs and past generational beliefs related to them. I am also someone who writes fiction. I have an urban fantasy series, so I have a foot in that world too. And then I am someone who, again, studies and also participates in sort of the living communities related to these concepts. So I don't really want to come off like I'm trying to say either fiction is good or folklore is good or one is bad or the other is bad. I think they all have their value and they're all important and they're all sort of intrinsic parts of human cultures. But we do sort of need to understand what they are and what the differences between them are. I also want to make it clear that my actual degree is in psychology, not in folklore, and the sort of soul-crushing student loans that I have from getting my actual degree mean that I probably will never be able to have an official degree in folklore studies. I can't afford to go back to school for it, is what it comes down to. So I use what I learned from the degree that I do have sort of in my approach to studying folklore. I don't want to misrepresent myself in any way as sort of an established or academic folklorist. It's a subject I have a lot of passion about. I certainly would go back to school for it if I could. I can't. I tend to sort of frame myself as a bit of an independent scholar in the field, but I'm certainly not actually in academia for folklore, and I don't have a degree in it. So, just so everyone understands where I'm coming from, and I don't want to misrepresent myself in any way. Everything that I'm going to say here is based on my research into these definitions, into these subjects, kind of what I found out about them, and how I understand them. This is a very complicated and tricky subject, and you will find some varying opinions. And we're going to get towards the end of the video into why those opinions vary and why perspective is really just a huge deal with a lot of this. The point of view that the person discussing or relating the material is coming from actually kind of foundational to how the material is going to be understood. So hence why I'm starting with establishing my particular background and point of view. Moving on. What is folklore? So folklore, by the strict sort of dictionary definition, are the collected beliefs and practices of a community that are passed down through generations. So when we're talking about folklore, we're usually talking about a specific community's beliefs and practices. There really isn't any, as far as I know, like global or universal folklore. That would be getting back more into my actual degree, psychology, the Jungian, archetypes and collective unconscious, completely different subject. When we're talking about folklore, we're usually looking at a particular community. When I talk about fairies in my videos, I'm coming at it from the perspective generally of the fairy faith, which are Celtic language speaking communities and their beliefs and practices related specifically to fairies. Obviously, each individual community, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, what have you, will have an entire range of folklore that extends beyond that one particular subject. That's sort of why the fairy faith got singled out and made into its own kind of thing, because it's a portion of a wider whole within each individual culture. So folklore is not, strictly speaking, ancient or historic belief. You can have folklore relating to modern communities, modern groups, modern practices. It's really just that collected concept of beliefs and practices relating to something. This is, of course, sort of the Cliff Notes version. We could probably have an entire long video just on folklore and details of folklore. But for our intents and purposes, the important thing to understand: what is folklore? The beliefs and practices of a community, relating often to particular subjects or things. So you can have like cryptid folklore, particularly in the US, that's kind of a big thing. You can have folklore around aliens and UFOs. It's another modern example. These are all things that can have their own sort of system of folklore. In contrast to that, what is fiction? Fiction is something usually in the form of prose, of a story, that is invented or created generally for the purpose of entertainment, sometimes for the purpose of education. So when we're talking about fiction, we are talking about stories that are intentionally created and put out there for people to consume as an entertainment. Sometimes with some moral lessons, if we're looking at like Chaucer, for example. Morality plays also used to be a big thing. So you can have that concept in fiction. It's not always purely just for fun. But the key aspect with fiction is that it is something that is intentionally created or written in order to tell a particular story. Now, we also have some other sort of niche concepts that need to be addressed here that aren't, strictly speaking, folklore or fiction, but kind of connect to both and are also really important in understanding fairies and fairy lore, fairy folklore. So we have folklore, which are the sort of accepted beliefs and practices within a community relating to a topic. We have fiction, which are things that are intentionally created in order to tell a story for whatever purpose. We also have something that's referred to as folkloresque. And folkloresque is effectively something that is not, strictly speaking, folklore. It is not the beliefs and practices of a community relating to, say, fairies, but it is adjacent. It is often fiction that takes themes from folklore and uses them in ways that are still sort of resonant with that folklore, but are not, strictly speaking, that folklore. So a lot of urban fantasy, for example, behind me on the shelf, well, that's Tolkien, not Tolkien. Everything else back there, though. A lot of urban fantasy is what I would probably categorize as folkloresque when it relates to fairies. When you read, Jim Butcher or Laurel K Hamilton, or Mercedes Lackey, any of those authors that include fairies in their work, they're not writing folklore. That's not the point of what they're trying to do, but they include folklore and themes from folklore into their work in a way that kind of resonates, in a lot of cases, with the folklore itself, but is not folklore. So we would call that folkloresque. It's reminiscent of it, it's connected to it, but it is not actually folklore. If you take, for example, I'll use Laurel K Hamilton here, her Meredith Gentry series. She has fairies in it, she has the she in it. She mentions the concept of elf-struck in it. And elf-struck is something in folklore. It is a folkloric belief that when a human encounters a group of fairies or elves, they can be sort of attacked and struck, as it were, sometimes with little invisible arrows like elf shot, sometimes just purely magically. And it can cause this sort of wasting disease in some cases, or other sorts of illnesses and ailments. So it's definitely a negative thing. It's not a positive thing. And when I say encounters, like it could be as simple as you're standing out in your field, harvesting your garden or whatever, and the sluishi, the fairy host goes by, and you kind of get struck by this fairy wind as it passes, and then you're elf struck, and then you become very sick. So that's sort of the folklore example of what this is. In Laurel K Hamilton's Mary Gentry books, she takes that concept from folklore and changes it, turns it into something else, where a human being who has a sexual encounter with one of the fairies in her books, becomes sort of obsessively enamored with them and will waste away wanting to have more of that encounter. That is what I would term folkloresque. It is not the folklore. It's not true to the folklore. It's not accurate to the folklore, but it is definitely riffing on the folklore. It's loosely based on it, taking it in a very different direction. So, folkloresque. We also have something that you'll run across online. It is sometimes referred to as folklore, which is a term that was coined in 1950 by a folklorist. The term folklore has kind of fallen out of vogue with folklorists. The preferred term, I believe now, is folklorism. So we have folklore, folkloresque, and folklorism. Not at all confusing. The older term, however, is folklore, and you will see both used in some cases. So what folklore or what folklorism is something that is, again, not originally genuine folklore. This is not something that comes from a passed down body of belief and practice relating to, for example, fairies. This is something that was intentionally created and intentionally marketed or put out there as folklore. So this is why it was originally called folklore. Trying to think of a good example offhand that everyone might be familiar with, but I'm probably not going to be able to off the cuff. The general idea of it is, let's say I decide to write a book, and I'm going to write a book, and in the book I'm going to have this story of, actually I just thought of a perfect example. So I realize I have no editing on my videos and it's just me doing stream of consciousness, but the Blair Witch Project, there we go. Excellent example of folklore. This is something that was fiction, clearly. It was completely invented, made up as a movie, but it was marketed as folklore. It was marketed as a true story of these events and these supernatural happenings and this incident that had occurred. And it's actually resulted in a lot of people believing that this is actual folklore, that the Blair Witch actually existed, that Burkittsville was where this all happened, and people will go there now into those woods trying to find the Blair Witch, even though it was completely invented for the purposes of that movie and having that movie put out. That is what I would call folklore or a folklorism. Something that was created and marketed as folklore, not actually folklore. With a lot of this type of stuff, what ends up happening, though, is that it's then absorbed into folklore, and the line between folklore and folklore gets very, very blurry. Another example of this, which I can't remember if I've ever mentioned in a video before, I know I've written about it, is the alleged Irish Banti fairy. And this is something that is not folklore. It does not exist in Irish folklore or belief. It never has. Banti just literally means woman of the house. It's a phrase that's used for like housekeepers or women who are in charge of a household. It's used in certain places in the Gaeltacht for people who watch children who are there like studying. So the word itself is an actual term in Irish, is my point with that. But it has no connection to fairies. Not a fairy, not a name for a fairy. It's actually a very straightforward word. You can find it in any Irish dictionary. What happened is in the late 20th, very early 21st century, a non-Irish writer sort of misinterpreted something from Evan Wentz's Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, which was a story of a fairy who was a Banti, who was a housekeeper in a fairy castle in Lochgar. And from that misinterpretation, and I'm assuming a lack of any Irish, thought that the Banti was a kind of fairy and didn't realize it's just the word for housekeeper. And so wrote about this Irish fairy called the Banti. And from there, it was taken by another non-Irish writer who wrote a very detailed, very in-depth description of this being, very strongly tied it to Irish folklore, was actually extremely explicit that this came from Irish folk belief, tied it back into the 17th and 18th century witch hunts in Ireland. Lots of detail. All of it is made up. It's complete and total folklorism or folklore, whatever you want to call it. The author that was writing about it, particularly the second one, gave it this very sort of deep-seated backstory that just simply does not exist. It is not a thing in Irish folklore. It is still to this day not a thing in Irish folklore. But you will find it online, and you will find it outside of Ireland, and people who are looking to these sources and don't realize that this is not genuine folklore, and have taken it and just assumed that it's a real thing, that the material they're reading is accurate, and run with it. So that's a prime example, another prime example of something that's folklore or folklorism. And also clearly really problematic because there's a lot of cultural appropriation going on in that. But my point here is we have these four interconnected terms. We have folklore, the beliefs and practices of a community relating to a particular topic, in our case, fairies. We have fiction, which are stories that are just invented from the author's imagination, in this case, about fairies, but have no basis outside of that. We have the folkloresque, which are things that are based in folklore, but are not actual folklore, which is where I tend to categorize a lot of fiction that includes fairies. It's got some folklore in it, but it's not meant to be taken as folklore. And then we have, of course, folklorism, which is straight made up, but marketed and put out there as folklore, causing massive confusion. So there are a lot of blurry lines when it comes to these four different topics, particularly between folklore and fiction, which I think is where folkloresque and folklorism come into things. The idea that you have beliefs and practices, which are folklore, but then you have fiction, you have people creating and making things up, which is fiction. And sometimes the lines between those two are not super clearly established. And the story I just told about the Banti, the folklorism around that, how that was invented and put out there and is now kind of becoming, in some places, a real sort of folklore because people do believe in it without realizing that it was made up, like 20 years ago. Very blurry between these subjects. It's important, I think, to understand here, and this is why I started this video by explaining my perspective on these subjects. Perspective is vitally important in how we are looking at these topics and in the biases that are being brought to these topics by other people looking at them. So, for example, there is a debate you'll find online about whether folklore should be in the nonfiction section, which is where it is now, or in the fiction section, because there are people who feel that all folklore is fiction. If you look up definition of folklore, meaning of folklore, what is folklore online, you will find many sources that will pop up saying folklore is fiction. Folklore is stuff that was made up and that gets passed on in communities. I personally have a huge problem with that, so I'm admitting my bias up front. Part of the reason that some people take that perspective is because if you are coming at folklore from an entirely rationalist, skeptical perspective, you do not believe that fairies exist. You don't believe in anything outside of ordinary reality, tangible reality, whatever you want to call it, then obviously when you have stories about fairies, because you do not believe fairies exist, those stories must be made up. There must be a point where somebody made up a story about this, and then it got passed on and people just started assuming it was real. That is a very particular perspective, and it's important to understand that. The idea that folklore is fiction, that everything was made up by a human at some point in order to tell a story, and that at some later point was passed on and confused for truth, is a very particular perspective. If you have the perspective, which I do have and I admit, of people who are in these living communities, who have these beliefs, who are participants in folklore, if you will, the people who believe and practice these things, you have a completely different perspective. You do not believe that these are made up stories. You do not think that someone effectively told a lie, that all of this is based on different people in different places making up these stories that kind of get brought together and homogenized and correlated and all this other stuff into this body of belief and practice. You believe that these beings do exist and that humans have had encounters and experiences with them, and that your belief and practice is shaped by other people's, whether it's your grandmothers or your great-grandmothers or people 500 years ago, but other people's experiences with these beings. It's sort of like, to give you a tangible example, I've never seen a tiger. Okay, actually, I might have seen a tiger when I was little at a zoo, but for the purposes of our example, let's say I've never seen a tiger, and I know other people believe in tigers and have told me about tigers and talked about tigers. We have cartoon tigers on TV. I've seen pictures of them, all that fun stuff. I have never personally touched a tiger, probably better for my health. I have never, been within a few feet of one. But I still believe that they exist. I still believe that they're real because I trust the other people who are relaying tiger experiences to me. I don't have to see them for myself to know that they're real. Whereas someone who is taking a more skeptical approach would say, no, I need to see it. I don't believe it's real until I actually see it and touch it. And if that sounds a little weird as an example in this day and age when we have like National Geographic, just know that there was a time when people in Europe who hadn't seen a rhinoceros or an elephant or a tiger or animals, from Africa or Asia or North America, basically did not believe they existed. They were mythic. And that is a true thing. You can look that up. So these are these two different viewpoints. And they're kind of antithetical viewpoints. If you do not believe that fairies exist, then everything you do relating to folklore is going to be looking for the source of that. Is this just a common theme? All humans kind of have this same sort of story about these otherworldly beings stealing children, for example. So then you start to look at why would that be? If fairies don't actually exist, why would humans have this belief across these different cultures? And you look for an actual physical human world explanation. And that is sort of where we get in the changeling lore, folklorists who are arguing for human illnesses or behavioral issues or, what have you, to explain folklore relating to changelings. If you believe that fairies actually exist, that these beings are, out there in some sense, however you perceive of fairies, because that's a whole complicated topic too, then when you hear a story, your first thought isn't necessarily going to be, how can I explain this in a human-centric, human world way? You might just say, well, yes, there is something out there. Even though I might not have seen it myself, I believe that it's there. I believe other people who have encountered it and say that it's there. And this story is true. This is not fiction. This is not something that somebody made up. This is an actual encounter that happened. So when we're talking about this different perspective, it's really super important to keep this in mind. If you are studying folklore from that sort of rationalist perspective, you're going to have a very different viewpoint and understanding of it than studying folklore as someone who comes from the belief system and does believe these beings exist. And for those of you out there right now that might be feeling like, okay, this is sort of an extreme difference in viewpoints, and especially for those of you who might not be in the fairy faith or have a belief in these beings and are thinking this sounds kind of ridiculous, in my experience it's very similar to the way if you tell someone who is Christian that their belief system, that their holy book is mythology, they will get very offended, many of them, in my experience, because they do not consider it mythology. They consider it truth. They believe in it. It's not myth to them. When you talk about the fairy faith, it's that same concept. You're talking about things that people believe in as an actual reality, not just as fun stories or interesting discussion points. So when you have that platform of belief, it is going to inform your perspective and it's going to shape your biases towards the subject. That's why I always try to be clear about where my bias lies. If you're dealing with someone who has the opposite bias, that none of this is real, it's a very, very, very different viewpoint. Yes, if you feel like these beings don't exist, obviously then all folklore to you is going to seem like fiction. All mythology is probably also going to seem like fiction. It's all just people are making stuff up. If you're coming from that perspective of belief, though, folklore is not fiction. Folklore is the collected beliefs and experiences sometimes over millennia, you know, hundreds of generations of people who have actually encountered these beings and passed on their wisdom, as it were. So fiction made up, folklore, actual belief. Even if you're in the it's all made up, I don't believe in fairies camp, I really encourage you to at least try to understand when you're studying folklore, particularly anecdotal accounts, that those people are not meaning to convey fiction. They're not telling you what they think are just made up stories, particularly first and second hand anecdotal accounts. There's a really good YouTube series by Michael Fortune, focusing specifically on Irish folklore, where he gets a lot of first and second hand accounts, as well as just some general community beliefs relating to fairies. And when you're talking to people who are telling you a story about someone they knew in a specific place and time that had an encounter with the fairies and what happened, or telling you a story that was told to them by someone who knew the person, that kind of stuff. These are not people who are trying to relay made up, invented stories. They're telling you their truth and their reality from that perspective of belief. Just please try to keep that in mind, even if you have that more skeptical, it's all fiction kind of viewpoint, because it is important to understand those differences. So I think we've kind of very thoroughly covered that, and also sort of where fiction fits into this. One of the reasons in a lot of my videos that I kind of emphasize the difference between folklore and fiction when it comes to fairies. When we have the folklore, we are talking about a body of material that's been passed down that's rooted in actual belief. When we have the fiction, we're talking about fun stories that people have made up whose purpose is not to convey generations of belief. Even when it ventures into that folkloresque realm, the point of it is not to be accurate to folklore. The point is to tell a story. You know, an author who includes, for example, like a borrowed midwife motif in fiction is not going to adhere strictly to what we find in the folklore. They're going to do what they need to do for their plot. So when I talk about why this matters in a wider sense, it's because when people are now taking their beliefs from fiction and incorporating that and turning that into a particularly spiritual belief system, pardon me, with few exceptions, what tends to happen is you're taking things that are not representative of this body of generational beliefs and practices. You're taking something an author wrote for entertainment value, and you're assuming that it's folklore, part of that body of beliefs and practices. And so you're moving forward with it from there. And a lot of times what authors do, or what role-playing games do for plot points, are not super functional as actual beliefs and practices in our world. And also sometimes, as I have mentioned in other videos, there's some levels of cultural appropriation that go on, or at least cultural tone deafness that go on, that is really problematic. And then to see those things forwarded as belief, particularly among pagans and people following the fairy faith, gets very complicated, and sometimes, particularly concerningly for me, overwrites the actual folklore and folk belief, because people are taking from the fiction, which tends to be more popular and more mainstream, and assuming that that's the folklore, and then projecting it, continuing it, putting it out there as more folklore. This would fall into the realm of folklorism, I think, at this point. And it then kind of takes on a life of its own. Now, having said all that, I fully acknowledge that this is a super complicated topic, and that there are things in folklore and folkloric belief now that can be traced to fiction. Shakespeare's writing, Shakespeare's fairies, did influence fairy beliefs, at least in some parts of England, after his plays came out. Were they based on folklore? They would definitely fall into that folkloresque realm. Were they actually folklore? Not really. He's including fairies as characters in his plays in ways that represent the plot he needed for those plays. They're not supposed to be literal representations of how these beings would have appeared in belief. Puck is a great example of that. I would probably have to do an entire video just on Puck because there's so much lore relating to him. But in older English folklore, from what evidence we do have, Puck was seen as more of a house kind of spirit, sort of a domestic spirit. Definitely mischief making and troublemaking, but not really what we see in Shakespeare's play. That's a different, the name of a popular character, Robin Goodfellow, Puck, taken from the folklore, but then used in the play in a way that was not 100% aligned with the folklore, but then kind of took on a life of its own afterwards. And this is something we do see across hundreds of years with literature that involves fairies that becomes extremely popular, and then those beliefs sort of tend to enter into common belief and then folklore, or at least influence folklore. We see the same thing with the idea of fairies having wings, fairies having pointed ears. Those are things that did not start out as folklore. Those are things that started out, generally speaking, as either an aspect of the theater or an aspect of artwork, and worked their way in eventually to fiction, and then to popular culture, and then more widely to general belief. So this is not a strictly clear-cut subject. There is a lot of overlap and confusion in all of this, and I want everyone to understand that if I'm presenting this in a way that makes it seem like it's very simple and straightforward, I apologize, because it's definitely not simple or straightforward. It's very complicated and convoluted, and there is a lot of overlap between the different subjects. But the key difference, I think, to keep in mind is that particularly modern fiction, modern urban fantasy, modern high fantasy is not written to be folklore. It's not written based on generations of belief. It's the author making stuff up. And I will fully admit, with my own urban fantasy, which does have a lot of fairy lore, a lot of fairy lore worked into it, there are points where I vary from certain things because I kind of had to for the plot of the story I'm telling. And I'm trying generally to stay as close as I can, and even I'm not doing it, so just keep that in mind. Fiction is not really where you want to be going for your folklore. You want to be going to actual folklore. On that note, and to work towards wrapping up the video, I did want to give a couple examples looking at urban fantasy of sort of what would qualify as like better versus worse. And not worse in a judgmental sense, but just worse in the sense of uses folkloric terms in ways that are definitely not true to the actual folklore, takes much more liberties with the folklore versus the ones that don't. So, first one, Mercedes Lackey, Born to Run, her Sarah to Edge series. I actually super love, this was like my gateway to urban fantasy back in the day. Dating myself a little bit there, but I really love this book. I love the ridiculously cheesy cover, because it's glorious. And I actually really like Mercedes Lackey as an author. I like her books. I like this book, but this is not the place you want to go for folklore. For one thing, Banshee, which means fairy woman, very straightforward Irish. In her book, she changes to Bane, B-A-N-E, Banshee, as in death of elves, and has this character that's completely based on the idea of a being who sort of kills elves. That's its thing, which is 100% not folklore. That is not what a banshee is at all in any way. And the way she describes her elves is her fantasy, her fiction. They have pointed ears. They have cat eyes, cat pupiled eyes. They're just, she's inventing them. I mean, she does include some actual folklore in here, and it is a very good story, but it is not something you want to read and then assume this is your basis for folklore. This one I actually kind of already touched on, Laurel K Hamilton. This is the first in her Mary Gentry series, A Kiss of Shadows. Again, it does incorporate folklore, it does incorporate fairies, but very fast and loose with everything that's included in here. It's a fun story, but it's not a fun story that's going to give you any actual grounding in folklore, functional folklore. In contrast to that, we have another one of my favorites, Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. This is probably one of the most accurate books for fairy folklore in fiction that I've ever run across. It's just super on point in a lot of ways, but it is still fiction. It is still not actual folklore. It's accurate, but it's not folklore. I should say it's mostly accurate. Another good one, which also again one of my favorite books, Terry Pratchett's Lords and Ladies. The elves are appropriately vicious in here. I take a lot of my favorite quotes from this particular book. It's fairly on point for the wider concept of what these beings are. The actual details, though, of what he puts forward are not. It's folklore clothed in fiction. And again, it's into that folkloresque realm. I recommend Lords and Ladies. I love it. It's a great story. But also not someplace you want to be taking your folklore from. It's a good story. It's more accurate than most of what's out there, but it's not 100% accurate because it's a good story. It is fiction. So moving on from that, part of the original question that I started this video to answer, what is folklore and can I recommend some good folklore? So for the millionth time in this video, folklore are the beliefs and practices related to, in this case, fairies. And one of the things I would recommend, for the Irish anyway, Eddie Lenihan and Carolyn Green's book, Meeting the Other Crowd. This is sort of a collection of different Irish stories about fairies, getting to know fairies. If you read this, you'll get a pretty good idea of how fairies are understood through the lens of Irish folklore. Eddie Lenihan is a Shawnee, he's a storyteller. So these are stories. These are not anecdotal accounts. This isn't like, watching Michael Fortune's YouTube videos where people will talk about their, mother telling them about the time their neighbor cut a fairy tree and then his horse died. That is not this. But this is still folklore. These are retellings of traditional stories that have been passed down through the community. Another good one, I will generally always recommend Catherine Briggs for pretty much anything. This is a collection of folk tales of England. It was edited by Catherine Briggs and Ruth Tongue. And it's just an assortment of different folkloric stories from England. So if English folklore is your thing, this is a good place to start. We also have, in my opinion, one of the classics, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies by Reverend Robert Kirk. This is Marina Warner's new edition. It came out fairly recently. Andrew Lang's is kind of the classic edition. The language in it is a little difficult for some people, which is why I tend to recommend this one more often. Brian Walsh also has a really good version of it, The Secret Commonwealth and the Fairy Belief Complex, which digs into the context of it and sort of explains a lot of things relating to it. But this is a very short book, which was collected from different things that Robert Kirk had written relating to Scottish fairy belief in the late 18th century, or late 17th century, sorry, let me correct myself, 1691. I believe, was when he wrote this. So late 17th century Scottish fairy beliefs. And these are literally the beliefs and practices of the Scottish community he was part of in Aberfoyle at that time. So this is a really good example of what fairy folklore is. It's those beliefs and practices of that living community at the time. Obviously, they're not living now. One hopes. So next we have this book by Patricia Lysat. It's called Banshee, the Irish Death Messenger. This is specifically Banshee lore, and it was her dissertation, I believe. So it is pretty hefty. But it covers quite a lot of folk belief relating to the Banshee specifically across Ireland under several different names. Highly, highly recommend that. I will say with some of these, particularly these last two, the first ones I showed you are collections of folk belief, either from the community or retold from the community. So those are the beliefs and practices as the people actually have them. When we get into books like this, we're talking about a scholar, a folklorist, who went in and collected various folklore and sort of collated it, put it together, analyzed it, discusses it. And this in particular, when we get into this realm of things, is where you need to keep in mind that bias that people will have. Even though the folklore is being presented as an invaluable resource, if the author tends to be someone who is looking for rational explanations for supernatural things, you're going to get a lot of analysis along the lines of, not in Lysat's book in particular, but in general, along the lines of, people believed this because they didn't know any better, but it was probably actually tuberculosis. Like, a lot of stuff gets blamed on tuberculosis, by the way. So we also have Mark Norman's Black Dog Folklore. This is focusing specifically on folklore relating to black dogs in the UK. Really, really fascinating folklore. Definitely overlaps with fairies, in my opinion. So those first books are examples of fiction. They are fun and entertaining stories that are written by authors in order to tell a fun and entertaining story. Those last ones are examples of folklore. They are people telling or retelling the beliefs and practices within their communities through the context of sometimes stories, but stories in the sense of things that were believed to be true, to have actually happened, as opposed to, stories that are just for fun. Urban fantasy, clearly super fun. I love it. I'm sorry, because I keep pointing to Tolkien, which is not urban fantasy. It just happens to be directly over my shoulder. Urban fantasy, there we go. Fun. I love it. But it is not representative of beliefs and practices of a community. And most of it is set in, obviously, alternate realities. So kind of not directly applicable to what we would consider folklore. In contrast, folklore, I'm going to keep saying it, and then you will never be able to forget my definition of folklore. The beliefs and practices of a community. So there you go. I hope that helps clarify things for people and sort of establish at least a general understanding of the difference between folklore and fiction. And yes, there are people that are going to view folklore as fiction because of their perspective. But from my perspective, the difference between the two, and of course, folkloresque and folklorisms, got to throw those in there too, and the blurry lines between everything. When I do these videos, I'm generally discussing folklore. I'm generally discussing beliefs and practices that have been passed down through communities, or in some cases, direct anecdotal accounts. Things that have been told directly to me, or secondhand things that have been told to me by someone who was told by the person it happened to, kind of stuff. I tend to include anecdotal accounts in folklore because they are still representative of those beliefs and practices within a community and tend to be incorporated into the wider beliefs. as opposed to fiction invented to be a fun story or educational story, what have you. And again, my perspective, my bias, other people may disagree. That's where I'm at, that's where I'm coming from, and I hope that clarifies at least a little bit. So, everyone, have a wonderful day, afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. Have a good one, and I will talk to everyone again later.